Good morning. On behalf of the Houndstein Center for Presidential Studies, Director Megan Tedeschi, welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2024 Hidden Wounds of War Conference. My name is Brent Holmes and I have the privilege to serve as the Associate Director here at the Houndstein Center. And as a veteran, I'm proud of the Houndstein Center's involvement with this conference and the commitment that Grand Valley State University extends to those who have served our communities and our great nation. The Hidden Wounds of War Conference would not be possible without the tremendous efforts of the Planning Committee, Dr. Michael Ryan, Dr. Bart Buechner, Jill Hinton-Wolf, Allie Gedeke, Cheryl Mankel, Reginald Ferrier, Shane Shearer, and Aaron Moen. We are also grateful for our partners, Grand Valley's Peter Secchia Military and Veterans Resource Center, Kent County Veteran Services, the West Michigan Veterans Coalition, the Michigan Heroes Museum, and the generous donors of the Houndstein Center. I now have the honor of introducing our guest speakers for today. Bret Moore is a board-certified clinical psychologist and prescribing psychologist in San Antonio, Texas. He is a former active-duty Army psychologist and 2-year veteran of Iraq. He is the author and editor of 24 books, including Transformed by Trauma, Treating PTSD in Military Personnel, the Posttraumatic Growth Workbook, and Wheels Down, Adjusting to Life After Deployment. He has written over 200 chapters, peer-reviewed journal articles, and popular press articles to include features for Scientific American Mind, The New Republic, and Military Times. His views on clinical and military psychology have been quoted in USA Today, The New York Times, National Geographic, and the Boston Globe, on CNN and Fox News. He has appeared on NPR, the BBC, and CBC. Dr. Richard Tedeschi is Executive Director of Boulder Crest Institute for Posttraumatic Growth in Bluemont, Virginia, where he has been one of the developers of programs based on post-traumatic growth principles to help combat veterans and first responders. He is also Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychological Science at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he served for 42 years. He has published 9 books and numerous professional articles on post-traumatic growth, an area of research that he developed while at UNC Charlotte. As member of the graduate faculty, he taught courses, professional ethics, psychological treatment, psychological personality, and positive psychology, among others. He was chair of many master's theses and doctoral dissertation committees. He served as the coordinator of the master's program in clinical community psychology for many years. Dr. Tedeschi serves as consultant to the American Psychological Association on Trauma and Resilience and is a fellow of the Division of Trauma Psychology and the Division of Psychotherapy. He is also a member of the Division of Military Psychology and the Division of Independent Practice. Please help me welcome Dr. Bret Moore and Dr. Rich Tedeschi to the stage.
Bret and I are very grateful for the invitation to be with you, all of you here today, and those who are on the virtual connection with us. We are looking forward to discussing our ideas with you. So during our presentation, if you have questions for us, we invite you to interrupt us and ask along the way. We'll also leave plenty of time afterwards for more questions and discussion with you. So don't be shy about that. We like to interact with you and hear your thoughts and respond to your questions to clarify our ideas. Bret and I are good friends and we've worked together for many years now, but actually we've been doing most of our work virtually for our presentations since the pandemic started. So we're really grateful to have this opportunity to work together in person with you and present this information. So we anticipate a good day with you and look forward to getting started. Bret?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And as Rich mentions, if you do have questions, please stop us. We want this to be informal as possible. And I think there will be a mic going around, so just raise your hand and they'll bring a mic to you. So it's obviously like being here with Rich. I've been working with him for a long time, but I like being back here. I actually graduated from Western, a little college little bit down the road. Is it south of here? Is Kalamazoo south here? And I actually did my first doctoral clinical training at Mary Free Bed. So I have definitely an affinity for this part of the country, and I forgot how beautiful it is in the summer, how green it is flying over. So it's nice to be here, and it's nice to be able to work with Rich again. So we got some slides that we'll take you through, but we want to just make sure that we provide a really good understanding of what post-traumatic growth is, because you don't hear a lot about this in clinical circles, in the literature, but it's a topic that I think needs more awareness. Whether you're a clinician, whether you're involved in peer support, or whether you're just someone who likes to help out friends, colleagues, those around you, kind of deal with the struggles that they have in their lives. I mean, I think this will be important and useful for everyone. So, Rich, if you want to get us going, and I think we've already done a pretty good job on the bio.
Yes, so Brent just told you a little bit about my background here, so there you have it. I just want to give a shout out to my colleague Lawrence Calhoun at UNC Charlotte. Lawrence and I worked together for many years, developed this concept of post-traumatic growth, and Lawrence is now retired, but he had a very important influence on this field, and so I want to make sure I recognize his contribution.
Yeah, and Rich and I, and we'll talk about this later. So Rich is the executive director, and I'm the deputy director of the Boulder Crest Institute, which is based out of Bluemont, Virginia, but also has a kind of satellite site in Sonoyta, Arizona, and some other satellite clinics. So we'll talk more about Boulder Crest. So we work together in that capacity as well. But I became aware of kind of post-traumatic growth as an Army psychologist. So I started off, after graduating, I did an internship as an Army psychologist, and then joined the Army, did my active duty service obligation. Spent a couple of years in Iraq working with men and women in uniform, right? Dealing with some pretty significant experiences. And I knew about PTSD, I knew about trauma, I knew about the symptoms people develop after experiencing traumatic events, but I never heard or saw this idea. What I saw in Iraq is actually people can grow and thrive as a result of their struggles with trauma. So that's why I didn't learn about that in school, so I tried to figure out what is going on. These people are telling me that because of their experiences and what they've dealt with, they've actually grown in certain ways from a psychological standpoint. So I just, like anybody does, I get on Google and just put in a bunch of terms and came up with post-traumatic growth in Rich's work, and it's history from there. So that's how I got into the area of post-traumatic growth as a former Army psychologist working in Iraq. So related to this, we talk about trauma. So when I was trained as a psychologist, originally as a professional counselor, as most people who are clinicians, you train, even though they say they don't train as in the medical model, when it comes to trauma, they really do. It's about symptoms, right? So it's about, if someone comes to me, I interview them, I ask them questions, and I kind of tick marks on different symptoms. If they have enough symptoms, then I give them a diagnosis, right? So they get a diagnosis, say, of PTSD. Then I select a treatment, whether it be prolonged exposure or cognitive processing therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's symptom focused, right? So the goal of the treatment is to alleviate some of those symptoms. And if I'm successful, even the outcomes are symptom based, right? So I give checklists to see if they've had a reduction in symptoms, and if they have, then we can assume, I think incorrectly at times, that treatment has been successful. And maybe they're even cured, right? So it's a really symptom-focused, pathological, reductionistic-based model of understanding trauma. I'm not saying it's all bad, but I think that's the traditional way of looking at psychological trauma. And if you can see here, the problem with that, though, is there's a lot of individual variability in how people not only perceive trauma, but how they respond to trauma. So not everybody is the same. And if you can see this cartoon here, it makes that point. So not everybody responds in the same way. And it's important to keep that in mind, especially as we move through some of this information. So I don't want to go into a lot of detail about the DSM-5, right? I'm not a big fan of the DSM. I understand why we have it, and I understand there's some importance to it, and it helps us talk the same language as clinicians about what people are dealing with. But I do think, and to give a kind of a kudos to the American Psychiatric Association, they did some pretty good updates on the diagnostic criteria for PTSD between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5. Criterion A, essentially the way it is now is that you're exposed to some type of traumatic event, some type of significant stressor. In the previous version, there was criterion A1 and A2. A1 was the event, and A2 was, if you can see down here, the response to the event. Intense fear, helplessness, and horror. So you didn't get the diagnosis unless you had both criterion A1 and A2. Well, what we found, the problem with that is that we were finding that many veterans were coming back from combat that did not have that A2 criterion, right? They didn't respond with a sense of fear, helplessness, and horror. Therefore, they weren't getting the diagnosis, which meant they weren't getting the treatment they needed, or they weren't getting the compensation they deserve, right? So there can be compensation associated with a psychiatric disability like post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason, I'm sure you're thinking, I know why this is, it's because military members train for trauma, right? How a combat veteran, a seasoned combat veteran responds to trauma in a deployed setting is gonna be a lot different than a 19-year-old college student who's sexually assaulted in a dark parking garage. Two different complete responses, perceptions and reactions to a traumatic event. So I think the DSM did a pretty good job. Again, we're not gonna get bogged down in PTSD, but I think it really makes the point that we started to think differently about trauma when they updated the DSM-5, and particularly about criterion D. So the DSM has done a good job by including these negative alterations in cognition and mood. Specifically, now it recognizes that there's some shattering of the assumptive world. So our previous belief system has been upended, uprooted, disrupted in some way because of the traumatic event, right? That wasn't really articulated that well in the DSM-4, which is important for what we're going to talk about in a bit, which is this idea of post-traumatic growth. And some other nice minor changes, but again, not a big fan of the DSM-5, but I think it's a lot better when it comes to PTSD. It's a lot better than it was in the previous edition.
And of course, these criteria all relate to this conference, Hidden Wounds of War, right? So these represent a lot of the hidden wounds that create these sorts of symptoms. Now, when we're talking about post-traumatic growth, we're going to be talking about the other side of the story. These wounds exist, and at the same time, we often see these positive changes, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So we're going to be talking about both those things.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So you said the shattering of the assumptive world. The shattering of the assumptive world leads to the trauma. What about the service member who comes from a traumatic background to begin with, and the military either exacerbates that trauma or is in fact the first safe, stable place when they hit to basic training or their unit? How does that factor into PTSD and then later post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, so the trauma definitely leads to the shattering of the assumptive world, right?
Right, but I'm
Yeah.
saying, but what if the
Right.
assumptive world is painful to begin with, right? Like a lot of my colleagues came from traumatized backgrounds in the military.
Absolutely. And we do know that even people that are in the military have a higher rate baseline of, say, adverse childhood experiences. So they have a higher level of trauma than the traditional population, the normal population, when they enter the military. I don't know, Rich, do you want to take how...
For example, at Boulder Crest, when we have veterans coming to our programs, many of them are really focused not on combat trauma at all, but on the trauma of childhood experiences. That's really what we end up focusing on so much more. Combat trauma really isn't the most important element in why they're coming to see us. So this is a very common situation, as you point out. And so when we talk about, and we haven't gotten to the point yet where we're really talking about this assumptive world idea and the core beliefs. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. We'll talk about that in more detail. But the point of the thing is that the core belief system needs to be recreated in some way which supports a more meaningful and fulfilling life. And that can be a problem that starts very early in life. And then as you as you see, for some people, military experience starts to provide a meaningful experience, something where people are being of service or doing something important. They're part of a community. And then when they leave the military, they're back in the same kind of situation again where life doesn't seem to have much sense of purpose for them. And that becomes more difficult. That becomes, again, a challenge to their belief system about what it is that life holds for me going forward. So it's not just one event for a lot of people. It's a series of events in life that continue to create for them these difficulties in figuring out what kind of person I am, what kind of life I'm leading, and what the purpose of it all might be, and to keep running into this problem again and again as life takes its course. So it's more like that for many people than one particular event creating a disruption in their belief system.
And
Does that make some sense to you? Does that sound okay?
And it's a good point, and it makes treatment more difficult as well. And if you look at this first bullet here about risk, that obviously previous trauma puts us at risk for problems down the road. And if you have multiple traumas, maybe from childhood, maybe domestic violence, sexual assault, motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters, whatever the case may be, that it further increases your risk of developing issues down the road. But it also may increase your risk or opportunities for growth, psychological growth in the future as well. Just one last point here to make is that it's important to think about, when you talk about trauma, to think about potentially traumatic events. Because again, there is a lot of individual variability in how people perceive and respond to life events. So not everything that we might think is being traumatic is necessarily considered traumatic for everyone else. If you think back to the idea that when I talked earlier about how the DSM shifted and dropped that criterion A2, it's because a better understanding of not everybody responds the same way. So when we talk about, we'll use the term traumatic events, difficult life experiences, significant stressors, but we're essentially talking about things that cause people to reconsider their lives. So I'm trying not to take too much out in the early stages, Rich.
So now let's take a look at how to think about trauma a little differently than we see with the DSM, as Bret was saying. So we're going to understand the trauma from the survivor's point of view. As Bret was just saying, we have potentially traumatic events in life. These are things that have the potential of being very disruptive. But a lot of people are able to manage those quite well. And we have to understand what these events look like from the point of view of the person experiencing them to see what their response might be and whether these events truly cause a traumatic response. And we're going to talk about a way of helping people through these circumstances called expert companionship, a way of being support and guides for people as they traverse the trajectories through trauma and its aftermath. And we're going to be paying attention to the possibilities for growth and how people can aspire to outcomes that include growth. So in this way, we're going to be thinking about trauma in a broader way than we see in the DSM. And Bret was just mentioning that we're going to consider the way people have a psychological or cognitive map of life and their place in life and their own future. And what happens here is people's ideas about these things become challenged because of the events that they're going through. They start to question things like their personal identity, who they are, what kind of world they live in. And this questioning or challenge or disruption in this belief system is fertile ground for the development of new perspectives on all of these things, which can lead people in new directions in their lives. So if we look at this assumptive world, and let me just explain that term for a minute. This is the set of assumptions we make about the world that we live in, including us. And we make these assumptions because of what we've seen happening around us and what people have told us and just what has made sense. And we often don't really come to terms with that or question it, review it or revise it too much because it seems to work pretty well. It helps us make sense of what we're going through. It's again the map of the world that we follow, and it seems to work pretty well. These are the assumptions we make about all of these things, and it's a system of core beliefs, basic beliefs about things that we encounter in life. And these are the things that get shattered or challenged by certain kinds of events, the potentially traumatic events. So what makes for trauma for people is what happens psychologically when they start to think about how benevolent is the world that they encounter, or their relationships with people, how safe are they in this world, how predictable events are, how much control do they have over what happens to them, how vulnerable are they, what kind of people are they, do they hold themselves in high esteem, respect themselves or not, and their moral code, their system of morality, and whether they've seen themselves or other people violate this moral code. All these things are part of the understanding people have about themselves and the lives that they're living. And things happen which make them stop and reconsider all this and think about it. And it's not just an intellectual exercise of doing this, it's highly emotional. When people now no longer get a clear sense of what's happening in their world and the world doesn't make sense to them anymore, it's highly anxiety arousing, very threatening psychologically. And it's scary not to feel like you really understand what's going on anymore and things don't make sense. You don't make sense, other people don't make sense, your relationships don't. The future now has gone for you in some different direction you never anticipated. You know, all these things are very disrupting and anxiety arousing. So the reconsideration of these core beliefs is not just an intellectual and philosophical exercise, it's a highly emotional experience. So one of the metaphors that we've often used to describe this experience is it's like a psychological earthquake or a natural disaster that's happened at the psychological level. So just as a city, as you can see here, in the aftermath of a natural disaster like an earthquake, has its infrastructure shattered. The roads are buckled, or the buildings have collapsed, or the water system doesn't work, the electrical grid is down. The city can't work under these circumstances. Same thing with us when our psychological infrastructure is shattered. We can't operate either. And we have to rebuild this infrastructure in a way that works for us again, that takes into account what's happened and then prepares us for what might happen in the future so that we'll be better prepared for those events that could befall us. So we've got to reconstruct our own psychology, just as we have to reconstruct a city in the aftermath of a disaster like this. Another way to think about trauma that's related to that is that we are kind of automatically writing our own autobiography as we live. We know our past, we have our memories of our past, our stories about ourselves and the life that we've lived. All our memories are really coded as stories. And we tell people stories all the time. You know, before our presentation, Bret and I were just telling each other stories of our lives about the things that we happened and the life paths that happened to us and the decisions we made and how we got to where we are. Just a series of stories of things. And almost all your conversations are composed of these stories. That's how we think about ourselves and our lives. Narrative is the way that we remember and explain ourselves. And so these traumatic events are turning points in the life narrative. We think we know the story of who we are and what kind of life we're going to live, and then things happen, and we say, oh, we didn't think this it would be like this. I didn't think this would happen to me. I didn't think my life would go in this direction. Now what? So these are disruptions in the life narrative. Again, we have to think through this, make sense of it, figure out what to do with the narrative that's taken this turn. So traumas turn the life narrative in a new direction. And when you hear people talk about events in life dividing their life into a before and after, then sometimes they're talking about traumatic events that have turned their life in a new direction. But the point of this is, even though this is scary at the time, it's very disruptive at the time, it also provides an opportunity for post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, so and this brings us to just a general, textbook definition of what is post-traumatic growth. So a little bit of a build-up. So it's essentially, as you can see here, it's not just something that happens, but it's a process. It's not just an outcome, it's a process that people go through. You see here the experience of positive changes in oneself as a result of the struggle with a traumatic event. And the word struggle is important. The growth doesn't occur because of the traumatic event. It occurs because of the struggle or the engagement with the traumatic event and the reconsideration or the reconsolidation of kind of the belief system going forward. So it is the positive psychological changes that can occur as a result of the struggle with a traumatic event. And these are transformative changes. This isn't New Year's resolutions, right? Where on the end of the year, you say, I'm gonna stop doing this, and by January 15th, we're back to our old ways. These are sustained transformative changes that occur over a period of time. And the concept is based on 5 domains. So when Rich, was it the 90s when you and Lawrence did the what we call factor analytic studies, looking for kind of themes in stories that people were telling that they were working with. They found 5 domains of growth, new possibilities. Things that I didn't think were possible now are. Things that I didn't think I could do now are feasible, realistic. Relating to others, more compassionate, more patient with people, connecting with people on a deeper level. Personal strength, even though post-traumatic growth and resilience are not the same thing, you can achieve resilience through growth, right? So a personal strength, the things that I didn't think were possible that I can manage now are. And I saw this quite a bit with surviving spouses that lost a husband on deployment, where now not only were they forced to deal with the incredible loss of a loved one, but now we're put in the role of being the primary breadwinner or being the single parent, taking care of the home, making sure the car's maintained. Things that she did not believe that she could do prior. All these things that have to be done. How do I do this on my own? But over time, come to realize that I can, and developed a sense of a new personal strength and confidence in her abilities to manage these things, which is important because that helps weather future storms, right? Because life is not about just one difficult event. It's about a series of difficult events. And then when you can develop this personal strength that allows you to deal with what comes at you later in life, which inevitably difficult experiences will occur. Appreciation for life, so gratitude. Things that maybe I took for granted now have more meaning, or I acknowledge the meaning of those things. And then spiritual and existential change. Yes, there can be growth and a deeper connection to your higher power, God, religion, greater practices with a person's religion, but also asking those bigger questions, the existential questions. Why am I here? What's the point of this? What am I going to do with the next 20, 30 years of my life? What is the meaning of life? wrestling with those questions, those difficult questions that don't have a lot of easy answers. So these are generally the 5 domains that we talk about when we talk about post-traumatic growth. And they're not mutually exclusive, right? We see people grow in one or all of these domains. So it's not just, well, the person experiences greater connection to others. It could be multiple areas, and we can measure this through an inventory we'll talk about later, the post-traumatic growth inventory for people. So Rich, do you want to say anything else about how you and Lawrence came up with these 5 domains?
Well, these are empirically derived, so they're derived out of the responses of hundreds of people to questions that we asked them about their experiences in the aftermath of trauma. The questions themselves came out of interviews that we did with people who had suffered physical disabilities in adulthood or losses, various kinds in adulthood. And we took what they said, created questions, and then asked those questions of hundreds of people, and then subjected those things, those responses to factor analytic work, which is a mathematical way of reducing a lot of concepts to some clusters, and these are the clusters that emerge from that work. So they weren't originally out of our own minds, our own concepts. It really emerged out of the listening that we did to the people who were trauma survivors and what they were telling us. So that's important because it's a basis for all the work we've done. We've tried to really focus on what people who have gone through these kinds of events tell us about their experience. And that's what our research is based on, and that's what our clinical work is based on. Good listening to the people who have actually gone through the experiences. So post-traumatic growth is a term that we've applied to these experiences, but it's not a new concept. I mean, this growth experience is something that's been known for the millennia. Ever since there's been any writing or stories about trauma, there are stories about these kinds of outcomes. So we're not claiming that this has never been recognized before. We just given a term to it so that we can talk about it in that way in the research and clinical world. Because post-traumatic growth is found in the wisdom literature of the great religions, and maybe you'll find them in stories and literature that you're familiar with today. For example, if you look at superhero stories, a lot of them are basically post-traumatic growth stories. You know, superheroes emerging out of traumatic circumstances and then doing something remarkable as they find their strengths and their purpose.
And the cultural piece, I think, is important to see here. This is not something that's unique to United States, right? So the post-traumatic growth inventory that I mentioned earlier, how many languages has that been?
At least 25 now.
25 languages. So this is cross-cultural. So this is something that we see throughout the world. This is not American-centric or Eurocentric. This is throughout the world that we see this.
So we're going to just present you with some quotes that demonstrate this broad understanding across time and cultures of this post-traumatic growth concept. So this is a quote from Billy Graham, the evangelist, from a book that he wrote about suffering. And it's a great metaphor, I think, for what we're talking about here. And it's useful sometimes when we're dealing in the world of trauma to talk in terms of metaphor, because these experiences are very often difficult for people to explain to others because they're so emotional and deeply felt. So metaphors are helpful to us. So this is a good one here. Suffering tends to plow up the surface of our lives to uncover depths that provide greater strength of purpose and accomplishment. Only deeply plowed earth can yield bountiful harvests. So a nice metaphorical way of describing this post-traumatic growth process that we're talking about here. In Buddhism, we find a very clear focus on suffering and what to do about it. And because of that, a lot of Buddhist concepts have been finding their way into psychology practice in the past couple decades. Very useful ways of addressing how to respond to traumatic events, to suffering. So one of the things that we find in Buddhism is that we have to recognize that suffering is part of human life, so we don't make it personal. We say, well, we're human beings, so you know what? We're going to get a dose of suffering in our lives. It's just the price of admission to being human, and we have to therefore go towards it, embrace it, rather than just react to it as a scary thing, and really look at it, understand what's going on with us, and ultimately accept it. Accept it as part of our lives, part of our narrative. And then we understand suffering better, and we understand being human better. And we are connected better with the rest of humanity that goes through suffering as well when we deeply engage in our own experience with suffering rather than avoid it. And this also allows us to think existentially, because the existentialists, in a way, emphasize some of these same kinds of concepts where there's part of the human condition that just involves suffering. Part of being human involves suffering, guilt, because we are imperfect and we make mistakes throughout our lives, sometimes big ones that hurt other people, hurt ourselves, and we're just going to screw some things up. So guilt is part of the process. And transitoriness, everything changes. We can't count on things remaining the same. Everything's going to change around us, and we're going to change, and we're going to have to deal with change. We have to deal with suffering, our mistakes, and changes in life. And we have to engage these things, not avoid them, but face up to them to develop meaning in our living. So suffering doesn't have to be meaningless suffering, mere suffering for no other purpose, but we can find ways to create a purpose around these things. And when we're doing so, that's when we're going to start to see these growth outcomes that Bret was just talking about. Now, one of the concepts in psychology that you're probably familiar with that's become extremely popularized is resilience. There's all kinds of talk about resilience now. And resilience is the ability to recover readily from a problem or resistance to adversity. And that means it's different from post-traumatic growth. It's not the same thing, because with post-traumatic growth, we're not just getting back to baseline or staying at baseline essentially despite what we're confronting. We are impacted heavily by what we confront. And then as a response to that, a struggle through the aftermath of these experiences, we change. We transform into somebody different than we were before. So it's not a return to baseline or staying at baseline. It's becoming something different, a transformative response. So in that way, resilience is not the same as post-traumatic growth. But as Bret was saying, the transformations that we go through can lead us to a more resilient way of facing future events. Just like when we rebuild the city, we rebuild it maybe to better withstand the traumatic events of the future.
Yeah, and it's not that resilience is a bad thing. It's a bad term. It's gotten watered down so much over the years, and it's used for everything, right? And you'll sometimes hear people interchangeably use terms resilience, positive psychology, post-traumatic growth, and these are all separate things. So I just wanted to make sure to make that point. So whether you're a clinician, whether you're a peer support provider, whether you're someone that just kind of likes to help out friends and family to deal with life struggles. If you listen for growth in their stories, you will hear them, right? But if you listen, and I'll share the example, and I share this example often, and it's actually how I came to understand and know Rich's work, is that after I completed my internship, Dwight D. Eisenhower Army Medical Center out in Georgia, I got sent to Fort Hood, which is not Fort Hood anymore, but I went to Iraq shortly after. I wasn't even licensed. Can you believe they could send you back when I was in the Army? You didn't have to be licensed to be sent and manage a clinic. And Rich and I were talking about how crazy that is. No experience, and you're managing an outpatient mental health clinic in a deployed setting. Fortunately, I made it through it and learned some great lessons. But one of my first cases, I was trained in all the acronym therapies. You know what the acronym therapies are? PE, prolonged exposure, EMDR, CPT. Again, are benefits to these therapies. And I was new, naive, inexperienced psychologist. And I had this young soldier. He must have been 19 at the time. And this was his second, or maybe his third. Maybe his second. And he went through some really rough experiences, right? So he came to me in my clinic and met the criteria for PTSD, classic symptoms of PTSD, the nightmares, the intrusive thoughts, the hypervigilance, the hyperarousal, all those kinds of things. So like the good clinician I am, I say, hey, listen, I got this therapy, right? Prolonged exposure. So I'm gonna ask you to relive this trauma in this office with me. Just close your eyes and tell me the story. And the good soldier he closed his eyes and started telling me this story. For the point of the prolonged exposure, for those of you who don't know, is for habituation to occur, right? So over time, the more you talk about something that's distressing for you, the less impact it's gonna have over you over time. So he closed his eyes, he's telling the story, and I'm checking in with him, see how he's doing, and he just stopped and said, listen, hey doc, I wanna tell you about something else that I've noticed that's happened to me over the last year, over this current deployment. And I said, all right, we'll get to that, right? I wasn't all that dismissive, but I was probably somewhat dismissive of what he was trying to tell me at the time. And the good soldier he closed his eyes and just did what I asked him, right? And he started telling the story and telling me this traumatic event that was very distressing for him. And he stopped again and said, listen, but I want to tell you about something else that I've noticed. And I said, well, we'll get to that, right? But first, let's just stay on script, right? Because I was new, and they train you in these manualized therapies. You got to follow it in this way. And they tell you if you break it, you're not doing it right, and you're a bad clinician. So there's a lot of guilt and shame that goes along with these manualized acronym therapies. So finally, the third time, he says, listen, doc, you're not listening to what I'm saying. He was a bit more confrontational this time, and it kind of caught me off guard. And I said, okay, well, what's going on? He said, yeah, I'm dealing with all these issues, but I also noticed that I'm connecting deeper to people. And he was able to talk about how his ability to be more patient with the people in his unit, how he was more compassionate about what people were going through, how he felt the desire to connect with people on a deeper level. He connected all this to the challenges he's had and him struggling with the events that happened to him in Iraq, even to the point where he had re-engaged with his father, where they had a very difficult, strained relationship, to the point where his father told him before this deployment, says, I don't even care if you come back, right? Essentially saying, you can die over there. I don't care if I ever see you again. They had reconnected. And this young soldier, 19, educating me, the doctor, about things that were happening in his life that I'd never really considered, that people can actually find meaning and fulfillment and purpose and gains as a result of their struggle with some type of traumatic event. So I found that very powerful. I didn't know what it was, and that's why I just got on Google or Yahoo to find out what is this. And there is this whole field out there on post-traumatic growth that I knew nothing about, because they didn't tell me this as a clinician, as a student. I had no idea that this even existed. So if you listen, you will hear for these things, but you got to listen. You can't be like me. You can't be hard-headed, stubborn, think you know what the other person is going through. You have to listen and understand what they're telling you. So these are some other examples that we've found in our work with people. So this is a sailor whose legs were amputated in a shipboard accident. A lot more good things have happened to me since that accident that probably wouldn't have happened. I don't regret it. I don't wish it hadn't happened. I really like that. So he's not saying that I'm glad this happened. It's also not saying that I'm glad it didn't happen, right? So this is a clear example of how someone could say something that very significant in my life happened, negative in a negative way, but as a result, there have been gains and benefits related to this.
And let me just make a point here. What happened with this fellow is that after his legs were amputated, of course, he was no longer in service. He had to find something else to do. He ended up going to law school. And he said that, I think I would have just stayed in the Navy and been in career Navy if this hadn't happened. But now, I graduated from law school and, my life is completely different and I'm doing really well that way. It just changed the course of my life, new life narrative completely. And he says, I don't wish it hadn't happened. It's an interesting way of saying it, isn't it?
It is.
He doesn't say, I'm glad it happened. He doesn't say, I'm glad it didn't. It's sort of the middle ground of this, recognizing that it changed the course of his life in a way he really appreciates. And it also reminds me of another fellow that I talked with. This was a fellow I talked with when we were first doing our narrative compilations from people who had suffered physical injuries in adulthood. And so the first book that I wrote, on the first page of that book, I actually quote this guy because it was just so striking to me. He was paralyzed and he was sitting in this wheelchair, and I was doing this interview with him. And he started talking to me about the motor vehicle accident that paralyzed him. And he did say, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. He did say that this was the best thing that ever happened to me. And he says, I don't wish it hadn't happened. Okay? I don't wish that it hadn't happened. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me because it changed my life in a way that I never would have changed otherwise. And he said, I might not even be alive if I kept living my life the way I had been living it. And this motor vehicle accident stopped me in my tracks. And I had to reconsider everything. And what had happened to him was he had changed his life. He had reconnected with his family, kind of like what you were talking about with the soldier. Reconnected with the family he'd been estranged from because he had been using drugs a lot. And he ended up in a rehab center, because of his paralysis. And a doctor had said to him, you have a pretty good attitude about this, and maybe you can help some of the other young men, because he was like in his early 20s, that are going through this. And so he started talking to these other fellows and found that to be very purposeful for him. And so he decided he was going to go back to college, which he did. And then he got a graduate degree in rehab counseling. And when I met him, he was a director of an agency that was helping disabled people. And he said, this would never have happened. I would never even thought to do such things if I hadn't had this accident and been paralyzed. So he said, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. So if you understand the rest of the story, it makes sense. If you just take it out of context, it might not make sense to you, but understanding and listening to his story, then you can understand how he can come to that kind of conclusion.
Here's a soldier who lost his friend during a convoy, another example. I struggled with Dave's death for a long time. I still struggle with it, but I look at my daughter, my wife, my home, and I feel appreciative. I'm sad that Dave died, but because of his death, I no longer take things for granted. I cherish so many things in my life. Dave gave this gift to me. So again, you will hear this term used at times as well, the gift. Obviously not that that person set out to give this to another person, but the person that is experiencing it sees it at times as a gift, and you will hear that term used. Again, you can see here this gratitude, this appreciation, this newfound appreciation as a result of his struggle with his friends passing. A Vietnam War veteran, I have gained much more than I lost from being in Vietnam. The taste is sweeter. The flowers are more beautiful, the delights of this earth are more fully appreciated and enjoyed. Again, this appreciation for life, things that were taken for granted, now no longer are. A bereaved mother, before Justin's death, I often said that family was my priority. I think I believed that, but my actions didn't always show it. Now, family is a priority in my heart, head, and my actions. I'm there for my other children and my husband. Not a day goes by that I don't grieve for my beautiful boy, but not a day goes by that I don't thank him for giving me perspective and making our family stronger. We all love each other deeper and can love deeper, and I love deeper because of him. Again, unimaginable loss, right, of a child. And obviously this mother would give anything to have her son back, but understanding that that's not possible. But also can acknowledge that because of this loss, as a result of the family's, probably the collective family struggle with this loss, that the family is stronger and they love deeper and are more connected as a result. Yes, got a question?
Hey, good morning. I saw his name up here a few slides ago on the existentialism, but it seems like a lot of what is weaving in and out here reminds me of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning and the concept of, I think, logotherapy. Is that the term? And the idea kind of that once we realize that we can no longer change a situation or that we then change ourselves. Is that kind of, I mean, are we in parallel with a lot of the stuff you're talking about of that concept and Viktor Frankl and that?
Absolutely, that's right. In fact, the book you mentioned, Man's Search for Meaning, is something that at Boulder Crest we recommend as reading. So yeah, you got it right. So apparently you're catching it.
Yeah.
And logotherapy is, just a way of focusing on questions of meaning and purpose in life and helping people direct themselves to consider how to make life, how to create meaning in their lives. So this term "searching for meaning" it's interesting because I think it's more about creating it than just kind of finding it somewhere. But you have to work at it and create it out of the circumstances that you're in. So that's part of the process.
Yeah, definitely encourage if you've never read. It's a very impactful book, Man's Search for Meaning. It gets a little bit convoluted toward the end with the logotherapy stuff, but the first 2/3 of the book are just incredible, and you'll see obviously the same themes that we're talking about there. So this is the last quote here from Rabbi Harold Kushner in the book Necessary Losses. So Rabbi Kushner lost his son to progeria, which is a really debilitating chronic illness where people, they age prematurely, die prematurely. And he says, I'm a more sensitive person, a more effective pastor, a more sympathetic counselor because of Aaron's life and death than I would have been without it. And I would give it all these gains in a second if I could have my son back. If I could choose, I would forgo all the spiritual growth and depth which has come my way because of our experiences and be what I was 15 years ago, an average rabbi and a different counselor, helping some people and unable to help others, and the father of a bright, happy boy. But I cannot choose, right? But still, at the same time, being able to acknowledge the spiritual, psychological growth that occurred as a result of his struggle with his son's loss, similar to what the mother is describing, with her loss of her son, Justin. So, yeah, a couple questions here. That's a good point to take some.
Good morning. Do you find any relationship with timing, as in a number of people I know who've lost limbs or that sort of thing, that in a couple years, they're back to sort of their set point or even above their set point? Cancer survivors, this sort of, have you come across that sort of thing that within a time bracket, if you will, and then sometimes that if it doesn't happen, it's maybe never going to happen, or do you I don't know, I can't articulate what.
Yeah, let me respond to that.
Yeah.
First of all, in terms of timing of post-traumatic growth, you see all kinds of trajectories there's longitudinal work on PTG that shows their trajectories of growth and different time frames where growth seems to develop. For example, in one study that I was part of breast cancer patients, we were tracking them over 2 years, and most of them showed post-traumatic growth in the early months after diagnosis, beginning of treatment. And most of them stayed at that level of post-traumatic growth over time, at least the 2 years we saw them. But for example, I was talking to one fellow, one cancer patient, and I remember he was saying, this was about a couple years out since his diagnosis and all. He said, I'm afraid I'm losing my edge. When I first, when I was first diagnosed and I was going through all this, I was really intent on living better and living, more purposefully. And I can feel myself slipping back if I'm not careful to some old bad habits and old perspectives. And I really want to keep what I have gained from the early stages of dealing with cancer. So there was a recognition that he had to be careful about this and keep working at it. It's not a passive experience. You get too passive about this, anything in life, you can go the wrong direction. So there is that. Another thing about timing, I remember one couple that I saw whose son had been killed in an accident. They were very unusual in that they said the night of that accident, as they were grappling with what had happened, they turned to each other and they said, this is too terrible a thing for there not to be some good to come of this. And they promised each other that they were going to make something good out of it. That's pretty unusual within hours of something like this to decide that sort of thing. So you see all kinds of things happening to people. And that's why I think you have to pay close attention to listening to people's experience, because there's a wide variety of experiences here.
Yeah, it also makes me think the idea is a lot of times people think that PTG is the opposite of PTSD, right? But that's not the PTSD and PTG growth can occur at the same time. People will still continue to experience distress, but also growth as they go through this process. So I don't know exactly what it was you said, but and I don't think we explicitly state that in the slide, but it's not the opposite of PTSD. They can coexist.
Good morning, and thank you. For a local connection, Christian theologian Nick Walterstorff, who split time between Calvin University and Yale, lost a son mountain climbing in Europe and wrote a book called Lament for a Son that I'd highly recommend. And a loose paraphrase of a powerful quote was, Scripture talks about how trials produce patience and character, and I'm loosely translating that too. And he said, I'm grateful for all of those things, but I'd rather have Eric back.
Exactly.
And it
Yeah.
correlated
Yeah.
somewhat with Rabbi Kushner.
Yes, exactly. Very close to that. And there is, I think you're referring to a portion in Romans where St. Paul talks about the development of character in the aftermath of trauma. I mean, there's another example of how it's been recognized throughout all of history. Yes.
Yeah, this ain't new, right? So this is something that was clearly documented, but really came into its own in the psychological sciences probably in the 90s because of the work that Rich and Lawrence did. Okay, well, let's get into we're not going to get bogged down in the research stuff. I just want to review a few things that I think are useful to know. And Rich has already talked about how these domains are empirically supported. Anything else you want to say about
No, we're
these?
just going to, here are the domains that we mentioned earlier. I think we're going to show for you some of the items on this post-traumatic growth inventory, which again are essentially quotations from the stories that people told us early in our work when we were doing our interviews. So these items, and we're showing you these because they help you listen to people. These are things you can listen for. These are things that people can say which indicate that they're experiencing growth in one of these or more of these 5 areas. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the things to listen for, or sometimes to ask people about. If you start to hear things in their stories, you can ask questions that really reflect some of these kinds of items. New possibilities, develop new interests in life, new paths for my life, do better things in my life, things of that kind. Personal strength. It includes things like I'm better able to accept the way things work out. That's that Buddhist and existentialist point of view as well. Spiritual and existential change. You see, we have things about life meaning, greater clarity about life meanings, better able to face questions about life and death, things of that kind. There's the appreciation of life, value of my own life each day, what's important. So basically, we are trying to emphasize here that it's the struggle and the aftermath of trauma that creates these growth possibilities for people. But of course, unlike that couple I just mentioned that within hours of their son's death decided that they're going to have to do something with this that was going to be purposeful, most people in the aftermath of trauma first are just struggling to survive, and they're not at all thinking about growth. So again, the timing in terms of your intervention as a clinician is really important, because you don't want to try to introduce these kinds of concepts very early when people are just in the struggle for survival. And that's what's on their mind. And as Bret was talking about, post-traumatic growth and distress, even post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, coexist because they're coming out of the same experience. And we see that it's reported across cultures. And we, of course, grow not just from trauma, but other kinds of influences in life as well. Recognize that.
And I just want to, when you said that, it made me think about the story you tell about the research, or maybe it wasn't research, but listening to stories of astronauts that experience psychological growth as a result of something positive or profound.
Yeah, that's Peter Sudfeld of University of British Columbia did work with astronauts and cosmonauts. And after space flight, looking down at the Earth and all of that, many of them came back saying, I have a different perspective on living life on this Earth, viewing it from that kind of place. So in terms of there's just some general results of some research studies, instead of going through studies in particular. Generally, severity is positively related to post-traumatic growth, so the more severe the traumatic event, the more growth you see to a point. And that's why some studies also show a curvilinear relationship where moderate severity of trauma seems to be most closely related with post-traumatic growth. And that's because we have to have something that shakes us up enough to force us into needing to change, to reconsider our assumptive world. The assumptive world has to be shaken enough for us to have to stop and think, what are we going to make of all this? Across the lifespan, late adolescents, young adults may report most post-traumatic growth, but we see it in children, and we see it in older people as well. With children, it's very interesting how young, as young typically from the studies that we've done, even 7 or 8 years old, they're able to get the concept that something good can come from something bad. In terms of our coping approaches, active coping, working at this is helpful. Being able to positively interpret events and to accept the fact that these things have happened rather than continue to kind of protest. I can't believe this has happened to me, this is unfair. The acceptance is important too. That's related to post-traumatic growth. And the ability to deliberately ruminate. That is, instead of the intrusive rumination that we see as a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, like Bret mentioned earlier, really starting to think more deliberately and reflectively about what has happened and what this means for me is a part of the process of post-traumatic growth that's very important. So we can reconstruct the belief system. And we mentioned expert companionship, and we'll talk about that in our next presentation today in more depth. But when people talk about their stories and they disclose, it's important to have the helpful response, the good listener, not like stubborn Bret back in Iraq who wouldn't listen, not a guy like Bret, but a guy like
never
you.
said anything.
Yeah, that's right. So you want to have helpful responses to these disclosures so that people can start to dig into these things and understand themselves. And then an interesting thing that's starting to come out of some of the research is that not only receiving social support is important, but giving it. Being able to take what you've experienced and use that to help other people is an important part of the process of developing post-traumatic growth. And we'll see, again, when we talk later about a model of intervention, how important that becomes.
Yeah, which is connected to this idea of mission. And again, we'll talk about it this afternoon, but this to help kind of facilitate and cement and develop in this process is this finding the sense of mission or purpose, to take what one has learned and experienced as a result of those struggles and give it back to other people within their community, which is a very important part of that, which is why I think not only receiving the social support is important, but also providing the social support. So Rich and I have mentioned we work for Boulder Crest Institute, which is a nonprofit out of Virginia, and they have a satellite place in Sonora, Arizona, which is really, it's a nonprofit organization that started to provide non-clinical services to wounded veterans. And Rich and I were kind of early on in the program to help create a program called Warrior Path, which was a 7-day kind of on-site. It's not residential, it's too clinical, but on-site. They stay there, and it involves help teaching people how to live better lives through this concept and through the idea of post-traumatic growth through a variety of resources and methods. There's no clinicians on staff. It's peer support individuals, other combat veterans that provide the services. And then we've got a few slides here to kind of tell you about kind of how the program is structured, and a couple of data slides to show you some of the outcomes that we've had. But this is the Virginia facility, it's not government funded, it's free, and it's based on generous donors throughout the country. And they train thousands of people just through the on-site Warrior Path program, but there are other programs like Struggle Well, where they train larger groups of individuals kind of on the same principles. And it's moved beyond just veterans, but also police officers, public service, fire, EMS, dispatch. I mean, anybody who is on the front lines, if you will, of helping other people. And this is in Sonora, Arizona, the facility. Rich, do you want to say anything else about Boulder Crest in general before we kind of move on to the Warrior Path program?
Well, we also have several other locations around the country where we deliver programs to that are not owned by us, but we train their staff and contract with other locations which provide these same kinds of environments. So we're located in Maine, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Arkansas, Texas.
Michigan. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know exactly where in Michigan that we have the connection with an agency in Michigan that we do.
That was through the mobile training team.
The mobile training team, yeah.
Which goes around the country and provides these programs in different places too.
So when we think about the Warrior Path program, which was started, essentially the philosophy is, and how this is structured and different than I think from clinical programs, is there's this sense, and we instill, again, this is not me or these are not clinicians, these are people that have gone through the program themselves and are combat veterans that kind of walk the walk, right? I mean, they know what it's like to struggle, but they also know what it's like to come out on the other end and lead more rewarding and fulfilling lives. But it's the idea and still the idea that there's a possibility for growth, which is kind of different than you think about clinical models, which is the possibility to feel better, right? That's different, right? In the clinical therapy room, I'm going to help you feel better. Whereas within Boulder Crest and the Warrior Path program, it's about, there's more than just returning to baseline. There's more than just learning to live as a diminished version of yourself, right? So it's a whole different paradigm shift. Veterans see themselves as suffering not because of character defects. It's not because you're crazy. It's not because something is broken. It's not because something's wrong with you. It's about because of what happened, right? And the post-traumatic growth model that's based on Warrior, that's part of the Warrior Path, is that survivors will benefit from expert companionship, which we'll get into more detail this afternoon, and it occurs naturally, right? So this is not something that has to be clinician-led. This expert companionship model, actually, in many ways, it's probably even better that it's not clinician-led. And you'll see this afternoon, if you're with us, how you can facilitate this clinically in a clinical therapeutic relationship, but also in your own personal relationships. And then it's very service and mission oriented, taking what you've learned and experienced and then passing that on to somebody else. The people, again, I mentioned it's peer support. The people that deliver the Warrior Path program have their own experience in serving. They've all been through the program. They understand the post-traumatic growth concept. They don't talk about symptoms and dysfunction. They don't pathologize everything. And they set the tone early on that this is a place for growth and understanding, not a place to come because you're broken. And they also use language, right? There's not a lot of clinical language. There's not a lot of theoretical talk that's out there, not a lot of psychological jargon that's used, which is good because sometimes we can confuse people with what we're trying to say. Very clear, concise language. And it's a training program, right? So it's not a treatment program, but it's a training program, how to teach people to live better lives. Rich, you want to say anything about those three?
That's good. So the program itself then is, these are parts of the program that we'll talk in more depth actually later on today in our next presentation. But it involves these 5 different elements which help people to move through the process of post-traumatic growth, as Bret said, in his natural process.
Yeah, a lot of non-traditional interventions. They have equine therapy, they have labyrinth, they have archery, a lot of different, even activities, techniques that are kind of based in sound psychological principles, but are not clinical interventions per se. Even something as powerful as psychoeducation it can have a huge impact. And there's a lot of psychoeducation, narrative creation, disclosure that happens naturally in just normal discourse between
But all
attendees.
of these different things that Bret's talking about are developed specifically to help people move through this post-traumatic growth process. So we talk about work with horses or archery. It sounds like some kind of fun, but it's actually really focused on personal development here.
Yeah.
So we have some data. We'll just go through this really quickly. This first slide has to do with the post-traumatic checklist. This is a measure of post-traumatic stress disorder symptomatology. And what we're pointing out here is we've got 4 data points here. When people apply to the program, when they first show up, at the end of the 7-day period of being in the program, and then after 90-day follow-up. So if you look at the bars on the bottom there, these are different symptoms of PTSD and how people are at elevated levels at the first 2 bars when they're applying and when they first start. And then when they finish, and then when the 90 days, you see them much lower. And actually, these numbers up here, 43, 41, 17, 18, generally 33 is a cutoff for PTSD diagnosis using this instrument. So people are well above that range on average when they're coming to the program, and you see they're well below by the time they leave. So it's interesting that we have a program that's really focused on post-traumatic growth, but at the same time, as a result of this, you see the symptoms diminish to an extent where they wouldn't even reach criterion anymore for a diagnosis of PTSD 7 days after they leave the program. So what we're doing to enhance the post-traumatic growth outcomes are also having a major suppressive effect on symptomatology.
Yeah, and we published a study recently with our Baylor University partners. I think this is based on what 400 plus
400,
people.
yeah.
And the first study that Rich and I did several years ago was on about 50 people, and we actually saw very similar gains at 18 months. Right, so this is 90 days, the endpoint, but we tracked longitudinally for about 18 months and saw similar gains. So this has somewhat been replicated, and we're going to have some other studies coming out, essentially showing people not only show reductions in significant symptoms, but also here improvements in growth. And this is the PTGI that we've talked about earlier. Rich, so when you say, so if you look at where they started in the mid-40s and to the mid-70s, Rich, how significant is that?
Yeah, that's a very significant change. It's interesting. These are the 5 domains of post-traumatic growth on the bottom, and we find that this one here shows the most change. That's relationship with others, and we're thinking that that's because the model that we're using in the program itself is highly relational. This expert companionship model. We also see really significant changes in the spiritual and existential change dimension. So the post-traumatic growth interventions that we're doing are yielding some really significant results. And this is another measure. It's a measure of depression, anxiety, and stress, the DAS measure. And we can see, again, over time, great decreases in all 3 of these things, depression, anxiety, and stress, and they're staying essentially consistent over the long follow-up period.
And we can provide you, I don't know how to get our information to you, but we can provide some of these more recent studies for people that are interested. We can send those to you.
We have a question over here.
Yeah.
I know what I want to know, but I'm not sure how to ask the question. And it has to do with family of the military person. I'm listening as if, and I'm hearing you talk as if the military person is operating in isolation. I was married to a Marine Vietnam who suffered greatly from PTSD. So PTG, how is or is not family engaged?
Well, there are some studies on this issue that show, first of all, that the family members are affected by the post-traumatic stress of the military service members. So families also have their own version of post-traumatic stress by living with someone who is suffering from these kinds of insults. So that's one thing. But with this expert companionship model, we are also emphasizing that families play an important role in not only supporting that military service member, but together finding ways through these experiences where all members of the family can benefit from the post-traumatic growth process. And at Boulder Crest, we do have programs which focus on couples and family members as well. So family is really very important in this. Of course, many family members, just as veterans, don't know about the things that we're talking about here today and don't necessarily understand, therefore, the process of being supportive in a particular way, which will allow for these growth outcomes. And that's why we're talking about this. So family members are crucially important. And Bret, I know you've met with family members of military service.
Yeah, but this obviously does not happen in a vacuum, right? So, and we often talk about vicarious trauma, but we tend to talk about vicarious growth. because you see that in families and relationships as clinicians, as practitioners. Do you think we're not changed by these stories and these outcomes? Absolutely, we're changed. So yes, it's a great question. I think you ask it eloquently. So we do see that growth that occurs in loved ones as well.
Hi, I was wondering if you see any gender differences in how these things play out.
There are gender differences where women are more likely to report post-traumatic growth than men, but they're pretty small differences actually. So, if you look at the research that's there, at Boulder Crest we have programs, separate programs for female veterans and male veterans, and we see similar post-traumatic growth outcomes for both.
Yeah, and we're actually studying that. We're looking at some of the data to better understand what those differences are. So I think that's about, so just some final thoughts here.
We have
I'm sorry.
question.
One more question, yeah.
The information's been really great, so thank you. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and so a lot of the information that you're sharing reminds me of information in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm wondering how that has influenced some of what you've learned or over the years with substance use disorder treatment. If you could speak on that at all.
Well, absolutely. Of course, AA is a peer-based program, just like, well, our programs are peer-based too. And of course, another thing about AA is you're encouraged to face up to what it is that you've been doing and the difficulties involved. And so this existential viewpoint of approaching things and really digging into it and understanding it at a deep level is something that you find in AA programs as well. So there are some connections there for sure. And of course, my understanding of AA, and I work with a lot of people clinically who are also in AA at the same time. One of the things that I understand about AA is it's not just about stopping drinking, it's about living honestly and living well and meaningfully and helping others, which is another kind of service-oriented or mission-oriented part of our program at Boulder Crest as well. So there are all kinds of ways that there are similarities, I think. Does that make sense to you?
It does,
Yeah.
Yeah, we always say in meetings, we wish that everybody could be in the program, but not everybody needs it. But these are other ways that the concepts can apply.
Right, very generally, yeah. Okay, so here's some final thoughts that we just want to leave you with and clarify. You were asking before about timing. There's no time limits to this process, all right? So, and of course, throughout life, we're not exposed to just one kind of difficulty or traumatic event. Life holds all kinds of surprises for us. So we're again and again faced with things that challenge us. So over time, we see that there are a number of opportunities, we could say, to challenge ourselves to develop new perspectives. And this is a gradual process. It involves a lot of work psychologically and emotionally. And it doesn't occur in nice stages or phases as sometimes people have talked about, for example, in the aftermath of losses, like stages of grief and all that sort of thing. It's a lot more complicated and messy than that. Sometimes we've kind of drawn a graph where the stages of grief would go one step after another, whereas what we're talking about here is more like all sorts of ups and downs and crazy changes in life. It's very complicated for people, very messy, and we have to understand people's individual stories. And there may not be closure. I mean, there's no real end to this. It's an ongoing experience with living life in a different way and continuing to challenge yourself. So it's ongoing experience rather than a specific outcome that you reach at a particular point in time. And then, of course, we've also been working with a lot of people who are bereaved. They've suffered losses. There's often that part of the post-traumatic stress experience of people that involves losses, deaths, and when we look at that experience, we recognize that people continue to be attached to those that they've lost, and that's something that we need to honor and respect. Working with military service members, this is a very common theme, how people continue to be connected with their, the people in their units who have died in battle or afterwards, and how they want to continue to be connected and honor them in certain ways. I'm sure you run into that a lot.
The military tends to be a lot better than that than civilians, because of the rituals and the connections and the connection to the unit. I mean, the military, obviously, probably most people understand that it's a very close community, and I think they tend to do a better job of staying connected to those that are no longer with them in various ways. So Rich and I wrote a book several years ago where we interviewed people who had gone through some very difficult experiences and kind of highlighted their stories and told their stories. We had a mother who lost a son to suicide. Sexual assault survivors, combat veterans that were near death. We kind of told their stories in this book. It's a very easy read, quick read. It's inexpensive on Amazon. All the proceeds go to Boulder Crest. We don't get anything off of this. So if you want to read some real life stories of varying types, this is a good opportunity to do that, to hear it in their own words. So we added narrative to the end of their stories, but for the most part, this is their words, them telling us their struggles, but also telling us the growth that they achieved as a result of their struggles. So it's not as impactful as a wish, as man's search for meaning, but it can be impactful in its own way. So, and I think that is it for the morning session. So we'll talk this afternoon about expert companionship, which is the way to facilitate post-traumatic growth in the people that you work with or are connected to. And we'll definitely talk in more detail about that model. So,
Well, Rich and Bret, thank you so much for such a great presentation this morning on your work with post-traumatic growth. We look forward to this afternoon. At this time, we'll go ahead and take a break, and then the breakout sessions will begin at 10:15, and the rooms are located, you can find the rooms in your programs. So we'll have staff out to help point you in the right direction. So take a break, and breakout sessions will start in 15 minutes.